Have you been accused of business fraud? My name is Andrew Ayers. I'm a business law and estate planning attorney with offices in Edina, Minnesota, and New York City. And today, let's take a look at this idea of business fraud and what it means for you if someone's claimed you've engaged in it. So the first thing that may run through your mind when you've been accused of some kind of fraud is that this is a very serious thing and you aren't sure what happens next. You're probably feeling nervous. Maybe your palms are getting sweaty. You're not sure. Am I going to jail? Is it something else? What happens if you've been accused of fraud? These alarm bells go off left and right, and it's a really traumatic and it's a really stressful situation if you've never dealt with it before. However, once we get past those initial reactions, it's important that we take a minute, take a step back, take a deep breath, and look at what are these fraud allegations, see whether or not they're civil or criminal, so that you can understand what you're actually being accused of before you can decide if you really need to worry or if this is a lawsuit that you actually may be able to win. So the first thing we want to look at is, are we looking at a fraud case or a breach of contract case? So what happens in the business fraud context is a lot of times the claims are between two businesses or of a customer against a business, and it's really a breach of contract claim. The other party is saying you had some kind of contractual relationship and that you didn't actually fulfill your duties under that contract. And in that case, it's not a fraud case, it's just a breach of contract case. You had terms, maybe you had to make a payment, maybe you had to deliver goods, whatever that contract said. So maybe they're telling you that they're going to sue you for fraud, but in reality, if it's a breach of contract case, you can't normally have a breach of contract and a fraud case at the same time. They're two different standards, and oftentimes the fraud can only be brought if there is no contract between the parties. So first, let's figure out, is there actually a breach of contract claim at issue there? And if so, we will deal with that like any other breach of contract lawsuit. There's plenty of resources out there, and I even have a book that you can read on how contracts become lawsuits that you can pick up on Amazon. Now, if we're looking at fraud, what we're looking for in fraud is that you intentionally deceive someone and that caused them harm. So it's different than a breach of contract where someone is saying, we had an agreement that you would do X and you didn't do it. The fraud allegations are that you purposely deceived me and that I've been harmed by it. So let's look at some steps we're going to take if we've been accused of fraud. And in this case, the accused is going to be, you've been served with a lawsuit for fraud. And that's an important distinction because many times you'll receive either a nasty email or a letter or maybe even a Google review that says this person engaged in fraud. That doesn't mean you have to answer it, doesn't mean it's a legal claim. It may just be somebody venting their frustrations with working with you in your business. So we're going to focus, because this is a legal channel, we'll focus on an actual lawsuit for fraud and what we need to look for. First thing we have to figure out is, what type of fraud are you being accused of? So the first type of fraud would be criminal fraud. And this is in the case where they're saying you have violated a law, one of your local laws, and what you've done, and this may result in your actual arrest. So if it's a criminal case that's being brought against your business for fraud, so usually it will not be against your business name, it'll be against you individually or your employee, or whoever the person is who supposedly engaged in the fraud. If that is the case, your first step is to call a criminal defense attorney. I do not practice criminal law, I only practice civil law. So I'm not the person to call. You want to speak to a criminal defense attorney if you've been sued for criminal fraud. If you receive a citation, maybe the police have shown up, you may have to appear in court or they may arrest you. But if it's a criminal case for fraud, you need to speak immediately to a criminal defense attorney. What I work on are what we call civil fraud cases, meaning a business litigation attorney like myself would be involved to help you, represent you in the business fraud case. Now, again, this is likely where your business is being sued. And if you've seen some of the other videos on the channel, when your business is sued, the business has to have an attorney represent it. You can't represent your business as the owner of the business unless you're actually an attorney who's licensed to practice law in that state. So presuming you're not an attorney and there's no exception that allows you to represent the business, when we have a civil fraud case, what we want to do is make sure we take that document to an attorney and meet with them and figure out the merits of the claim and how you can put in a defense, if you need to settle it, if you bring your own counterclaim. So we have to make sure we're looking through that lawsuit. And that is step 2, is we need to understand the allegations of fraud. And there's usually going to be 4 allegations if we have a fraud case against you. Number 1, that you misrepresented facts. And this is a very interesting inquiry that the court's going to have to make, is what kind of facts did you misrepresent? Are they serious facts? Are they important facts? Or were they something a little bit different? So in years past, I've had videos about dealing with ball bearings that get put inside of an automotive engine. So let's say you agreed to provide these ball bearings and they were supposed to be silver, but they ended up being black. And so you misrepresented the color of the ball bearing. However, the engine works just fine. Nobody ever sees the ball bearing. It's inside the engine. It's working. And so the question is, have they misrepresented a material fact? Did it really matter if that ball bearing was silver or was it black? And if it's really something that is not a material fact, you may not have enough to sustain a claim for fraud. The second thing we need to look at, was there an intent to deceive? So they're saying that you purposely deceived them, but did you really mean to do that? Or was it accidental? Maybe you had the wrong document in front of you. Maybe it was just something that you said off the cuff and you weren't even intending that they were going to hear it. Maybe it got back to them third hand. But whatever we're looking at for that allegation, we want to make sure that we look at the intent of the party who made the alleged misrepresentation. And these are important things to understand because you need to be able to prove these in order for a fraud case to be sustained. Number 3, the other party had to rely on it. They had to be the victim of what you misrepresented to them. So let's say, again, we had a discussion with a third party and the person who's going to sue you for fraud didn't even know about that, and that discussion was something separate. Well, if they didn't know about it and they didn't rely on it, then they haven't been subject to your fraud at that case because it's not filling the obligation because they have to be able to rely on it. So if you didn't tell them the misrepresentation and they didn't find out from you and they're not even relying on that misrepresentation, it's just something that was in an email that was sent to somebody else, then they can't prove that part of the case for fraud. And then number 4, and it's important in any lawsuit that you're involved in, is what is the harm that resulted from this fraud? So let's say that you did misrepresent the facts, you actually intended to deceive them, they relied on them, and we'll go back to the ball bearings situation. They're silver instead of black, they're black instead of silver, whatever the case may be. Was there any actual harm to the party? So if the victim of the fraud feels like they were misrepresented, that your intent was there to deceive them, they relied on it, but there was no actual harm to them, they could technically be able to tell a court, well, they acted fraudulently, but if there's no harm and there's no damages, then there's nothing for a court to award as part of a lawsuit. They may have hurt feelings, they may be angry with you, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be losing a lawsuit and have to pay them any damages. And so finally, when we presented with this lawsuit, we need to look at the legal remedies that are available with a fraud case. Is there financial compensation? Is there canceling of another contract? Or are there punitive damages, which we'd have to look at the statute, or if there was a contract that allowed for punitive damages in the case of fraud, I guess you could look there as well. So what we want to do then is look at what are the remedies for the lawsuit that has been served against you for fraud. Again, this is important where we speak to our attorney, go through with them all the allegations and see what are the actual damages and what would be the remedies available to the other party. So if you've received that fraud lawsuit, you're running a business and that summons shows up on your desk, maybe the process server sneaks in and has fun dropping it right on your desk, don't freak out. Take your time, take a deep breath and say, okay, well, first of all, let's figure out what kind of fraud are we being accused of. If it's criminal, let's call a criminal defense attorney. If it's civil, let's speak to an attorney who does business litigation so we can find out what kind of fraud case we're dealing with and whether or not we have to defend it and what we have to do to move forward. If you have further questions or you want some more information, you can go to my website, andrewmayers.com. On the front page is a red legal strategy session button. You can click that and you'll be taken to my calendar where we can set up a 15 or 20 minute free telephone conversation where we can talk about your situation, especially if you've been served with a business fraud lawsuit, and go through what your options are and give you some next steps. If you like this video, you can hit the like or thumbs up button below. You can subscribe for future episodes on YouTube. And remember, take a deep breath when you receive that lawsuit. You have time. You often do not have to respond within the next 10 minutes. So you need to make sure you understand the type of lawsuit you've been sued for, and then make sure you have a plan for going forward.